So let's now work on making this all look a bit nicer. For that, I'll start with that list, because we already have an app-specific static file for that, the challenges CSS file, which we include in the index HTML template. Here I'm already targeting the list and I'm changing the list style, but of course that's not all I want to do. Instead, I also want to give this some margin of 2 rem auto to center it horizontally, and I'll not explain too much about the CSS code here. If you want to learn all about CSS, we got a dedicated course on that, and of course there also are plenty of free resources out there. I want to write that code together with you so that you see how it is created, but I definitely don't want to turn this into a CSS course. That's just a side note. So here we have that margin. And we maybe then give this a width of 90% and a max width of, let's say, 50 rem. And I also want to give this a box shadow of 0, 2 pixels, 8 pixels, RGBA like this to give it a light drop shadow. Add a little bit of padding of 1 rem and set a border radius of 12 pixels to give this some rounded corners. With that, if we save this and reload, that's what we get here. And I'll zoom out a bit so that this is a bit easier to see. Actually, I'll set the max width to 20 rem here, I guess. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. Now for the list items, I also want to change the style. So I'll select the list item elements here by tag. And I'll give them a margin of 1 rem top and bottom and 0 left and right. I'll set text alignment to center to, well, center the text. And I'll set the font size to, let's say, 2 rem. And if we save that, that's what we get. Well, maybe that's a bit too big. Let's go with 1.5 rem here. Reload. And also zoom out a bit because I'm still zoomed in quite a bit. Now I also want to have a little border below every item. So I'll add a border bottom here of, let's say, 1 pixel solid and a light gray. Like this. But there should be some spacing as well. So I'll also add a little bit of padding to the bottom of, let's say, 1 rem. Yeah, so that this looks a bit nicer. And I also don't want to have a border after the last item. So I will select the list item, the last of that type. And there I'll set border bottom to none, so that the last list item does not have a border at the bottom. With that, if I reload, that bottom border here is gone, and it's still there for the other items. Maybe it would also be nice to have 2 columns here, so that this is not one long column, but 2 columns side by side. And for that, on the unordered list, we can set the display here to flex and set the flex direction to column. And set flex wrap to allow wrapping. And then give this a height of, let's say, 20 rem. If I now save this, we got a bunch of columns here. And maybe 20 rem is not enough, so let's go for 35 maybe? Something like this, yeah. Actually, let's maybe go with 30 rem. But that's fine-tuning, which will depend on the screen size and so on anyways. Now, we do have that border at the bottom below June here. And that's a bit tricky to get rid of, because this line break is not always at the same item here. But we can cheat a little bit, and under the assumption that it is after the 6th item, we can also select the nth item of that type and use the 6th one here besides the last item to remove the border at the bottom, so that this is missing there as well. Okay, so that's my list here. Now, regarding the text in the list items, I don't like the blue color. I don't want them to be underlined. So I will select the anchor tags inside of the list items here and set the text decoration to none to remove that underlining. And set the color maybe to a grayish color, something like this maybe. Yeah, gray color like that. How does this look like? That's not too bad, I guess. And it would, of course, also be nice if we could hover over these items and we get some visual feedback then. So I want to add a hover and an active style to my anchor tags inside of the list items. And there I'll then set the color to purple, or at least I want to use that as a base color and use like such a plum color here, I guess. Change that to hex code. Maybe like this. Yeah, I think that's actually not too bad. We have a light highlight when we hover over these items. Now that is the list. I also want to change my general application-wide styles. And for example, I want to give the body a dark background. So for this here, I want to set the background color of the entire page to black, or not to black, but to a very dark gray, like this, so that we have dark mode by default. And then back in challenges CSS, I actually want to go to the unordered list and give this a background color of white or a very light gray, something like this. So that if I reload now, we have that dark background and that brighter list here. Now, I also, of course, want to style the header. The header here is one of our includes, and therefore I will also add a separate CSS file here. Technically, you don't have to, but I think it makes it easier to then quickly locate styles that belong to different HTML files. And hence, I'll even add includes here as a subfolder, header CSS. That's technically not required, it just makes it easier to then find the CSS files that belong to your include HTML files. In there, I want to select a header, and here I then want to give this, let's say, a width of 100% and a height of 5 rem maybe. Give it a background color of, I want to take that dark color here from the body and set that here, but then use a little bit of a lighter gray maybe. Let's see if that works out. And I also want to style my nav in there, in the header, and want to use the entire width here and use the entire height maybe, and add display flex here to use flexbox to center the items in the nav bar, to use justify content center and align items center. Now, as a side note, because that's important, all those CSS styles are global. I'm splitting them across multiple files, but just because I have a header CSS file here and a header HTML file does not mean that these CSS styles in there would only affect this header HTML file. They would affect any HTML elements anywhere on the page if they match these selectors. If you want to scope styles, you need to use ID or class selectors as you're used to. So there's nothing special regarding the behavior of CSS here when using them in Django projects. Now with that though, I got some basic header styles. Of course, I now want to include that header CSS file. And therefore, in header HTML, I want to make sure that this is loaded. But since header HTML is an include which I use in other files, I think it makes more sense to include it in those other files. Like in index.html, I will quickly copy and paste my link, which I already have, and now also import challenges includes header CSS here in my CSS files block. And with that, if I reload, this is the header. And now, of course, we also want to change the header text. And therefore, in my header nav, I want to target my anchor tags and set the color to white maybe, set the font size to 2 rem, and the font weight to bold. And I then also want to set up specific hover and active pseudo selectors here, and then change the color maybe to that same plum color I used before. Let's see if that looks good. So I'll use this color here again. Save that and reload, and now we got all challenges. And I think that's a bit too dark, so I should use a more pinkish color here maybe. And I also want to get rid of the text decoration, so I'll set that to none so that this is not underlined. But with that, this doesn't look too bad. Now we can always go back to all challenges, and this has this styling. Now let's work on the individual challenge page. Of course, the header styles are missing there because we're only adding them in index.html with that link I just added, not in challenge.html, which is responsible for this page, and the rest of this page doesn't look great either. So let's work on this now. And for this, I'll copy this CSS files block from index.html to challenge.html to include the header CSS, and I'll include a new CSS file, which I have yet to add, and that's the challenge CSS file. Challenge CSS side by side to challenges. We could also rename challenges CSS to index CSS actually if we wanted to, but I'll not do it here. But we could do that to be in line with the template to which it belongs. But I'll stick to that file which I originally chose. Now we got challenge CSS here though. And with that, I want to style the h1 tag here, the h2 tag, and the paragraph fallback text. So let's start with the h1 tag. Here, I definitely want to have a big font size, maybe free rem, and I want to set the font weight to bold. And if I save that and reload, that looks wrong. And it of course does so because I'm using static, the static tag, without loading static. We always need to do that. So we need to load static here in order to use the static tag. And with that, that works. We're, by the way, getting that 404 error because we catch any errors in our view and always return the 404 page in case of errors. But now that's working. Now for the challenge, back here in challenge CSS, I want to align that h1 tag in the center. And for the h2 tag, which holds the actual challenge text, I also want to align that in the center. And actually, I think I will shrink the h1 tag to 1.5 rem and instead emphasize the h2 tag. So give that a font size of 3 rem and make it bold. And also both should have a color of white. And since I have quite some duplication here, we can therefore actually also create like a shared selector here where I select both. And I will outsource these shared styles into that shared selector and only have different selectors for the font sizes. And with that, that looks quite okay. Now the margins are not there where I want them. And I think I actually only want the h2 tag to be bold too. And then here I'll change the margin on h1 to 2 rem to the top, 0 to the right, 1 rem to the bottom, 0 to the left. And save that. And this looks better. I mean, for h1, I'll set the font weight to normal explicitly, so that the browser default of being bold doesn't kick in. And we might also want to give this here some color, so that we add a little color here, and we maybe use that pinkish color we had in the header for this as well. Yeah, I think that's okay. And I think that's good for now. After all, this is no CSS course, and it now definitely looks much better than it did before. Now, what about that fallback text here, like in December, for example? I, of course, also want to style this, and my fallback text is just a paragraph here. So in challenge CSS, I'll select that paragraph. Since the fallback text is the only paragraph I'll ever have here, I can use the paragraph selector like this. In reality, we will probably have more paragraphs on other pages as well, so we might want to use a CSS class instead, even though we technically don't need to here. But here I will do that and add a class of fallback to this paragraph. And then with that, set my fallback text here, or my fallback class here for this fallback text. And set the styles here then as I want them to be set. For example, set text align to center, give this a color of white, save all files, and reload. And that's quite okay. I don't want to make that super big. A little fallback text like this looks fine to me. Now, of course, feel free to fine-tune this styling more, to adjust the styles as you want them to, and to add your favorite styles. But I think that's decent. And we now therefore finished the look of this first dummy project here, this challenges project.